In Washington, the clock ticked louder than ever as the deadline for a potential government shutdown drew closer. Every hallway of the Capitol felt charged with tension, every whispered conversation seemed like it could shape the next 48 hours. The Speaker and his top allies in the House GOP were huddled in strategy sessions, trying to balance promises to their base with the looming reality that millions of federal workers and countless government programs could be frozen if a deal wasn't struck. The press framed it as political theater, but for the lawmakers inside those chambers, the stakes were frighteningly real. Behind the scenes, drafts of a temporary spending plan circulated like contraband. Staffers carried folders marked "confidential" and looked over their shoulders in case reporters lurked nearby. The idea was simple in theory: fund the government through November, buy time, and avoid a disastrous shutdown. But nothing in Washington was simple. Every page of the plan sparked arguments: border security provisions, defense spending, healthcare programs, even small allocations that most citizens never heard of became flashpoints for disagreement. Each word was ammunition in an ongoing war not just between parties, but within the GOP itself. In one tense meeting, a veteran Republican congressman slammed his hand on the table. "We can't keep kicking the can down the road," he said, his voice sharp. "Our voters are tired of stopgaps. They want solutions." Across from him, a younger member countered, "And they'll get none if the government shuts down. Imagine airports grinding to a halt, soldiers without pay, families left stranded. You call that leadership?" The room fell silent for a moment, each side recognizing the deadly political trap they were in. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, rumors began to leak. Journalists caught wind of the November plan, and speculation flooded the airwaves. Commentators debated whether the proposal was a lifeline or just another sign of dysfunction. Protesters gathered with signs accusing both parties of failing the people. Social media blazed with hashtags demanding accountability. The pressure mounted with every passing hour, and the fragile draft became the epicenter of a national storm. As the sun set over the Capitol, the Speaker knew the fight was far from over. The draft was only the beginning. Negotiations were still raw, and any misstep could shatter the coalition needed to push the plan forward. For now, they had bought themselves time, just not nearly enough. The following day brought a different kind of battle. If the draft of the GOP plan was the spark, the secret negotiations were the flames. Inside dimly lit offices, lawmakers gathered in small groups, bargaining over details that would determine whether the government stayed open or slammed shut. Phones buzzed constantly as aides relayed new demands from rival factions. Some wanted increased defense spending to show strength abroad. Others insisted that border security measures were non-negotiable. A handful whispered about cutting foreign aid altogether, redirecting money back home. These talks were far from orderly. Voices often rose, frustration spilling out as lawmakers accused one another of betrayal. "You're selling out the party," one shouted. "You're risking the country," another fired back. In private, some even admitted that a shutdown might be politically useful, a weapon to pin blame on opponents and rally their base. The thought lingered like smoke in the room, toxic yet undeniable. At the same time, Democrats closely monitored the divisions. Though excluded from the inner GOP talks, they knew every fracture was leverage. Leaks reached them through back channels, and they prepared their own counter-narrative. Republicans couldn't govern even themselves, let alone the country. For the White House, it was a waiting game, measuring when to step in and when to let the GOP's internal strife play out. The secret talks dragged late into the night, deals made and broken in the same breath. Every agreement seemed fragile, every handshake conditional. Yet beneath the chaos, there was a shared understanding: failure would unleash consequences none of them could fully control. Markets would shudder, public trust would erode further, and the world would watch America stumble. Still, compromise remained elusive, and as midnight neared, the fate of the government hung in the balance. The day of the public showdown began with an air of theater. Cameras were lined up outside the Capitol, reporters eager to broadcast every movement of lawmakers as they prepared to unveil the highly anticipated GOP plan. Crowds of protesters and supporters filled the sidewalks, their chants echoing against the stone walls of Congress. When the Speaker finally stepped forward to present the proposal, the atmosphere was electric. The plan, as expected, sought to extend funding until November, but it carried with it a set of conditions: border security enhancements, targeted cuts to federal programs, and promises of future debates on long-term spending. To the Republican leadership, it was a lifeline; to their opponents, it was nothing more than political gamesmanship. As the words rolled out across the nation, Democrats wasted no time responding. Within minutes, a press conference was called where leading Democratic figures dismissed the plan as a Band-Aid solution. One senator declared, "This isn't governance. It's hostage-taking. They're holding federal workers and the American people hostage to satisfy a fractured party." The soundbites spread like wildfire, amplifying anger on both sides. Television screens across the country played split screens of fiery speeches, each side claiming to fight for the people while the public grew increasingly anxious. Meanwhile, inside the chamber, arguments flared. Some moderate Republicans urged colleagues to embrace the plan as the only path forward. "We can't let perfect be the enemy of possible," one insisted, his voice trembling under the weight of the cameras and the crowd outside. But hardliners were unconvinced. They wanted stronger guarantees, no room for compromise on spending cuts, no wavering on immigration policy. The tension spilled out into the corridors where reporters swarmed lawmakers for soundbites. Some ducked the cameras, others leaned into them, eager to make their case directly to the public. Beyond Washington, the mood turned volatile. Protesters clashed verbally outside federal buildings in several states, demanding either a permanent solution or threatening to withhold their support in upcoming elections. Families dependent on federal aid programs watched anxiously, unsure if benefits would be disrupted. Federal workers worried about whether their next paycheck would arrive. The showdown was no longer confined to political elites, it had seeped into everyday American life. The GOP leadership knew the stakes. The proposal was their attempt to project control, but instead it exposed the cracks running through the party and the nation. What was meant to be a moment of reassurance had become a spectacle of division. By nightfall, it was clear that passing the plan would not be the victory they hoped. It would be just the start of a larger, more dangerous fight. As markets opened the next morning, the effects of the unrest became clear. Investors grew jittery, sending stocks into a downward spiral as uncertainty loomed. Economists warned that even the threat of a shutdown could harm consumer confidence and slow growth. Calls poured into congressional offices from business leaders, union representatives, and ordinary citizens, all demanding that lawmakers act before it was too late. Yet inside the Capitol, the atmosphere resembled a pressure cooker ready to explode. Factionalism within the GOP deepened. Members who had once stood shoulder to shoulder began accusing each other of sabotaging the party's credibility. One congressman furiously accused leadership of selling out core principles, while another shouted back that inflexibility was dooming the government. Staffers worked phones relentlessly, counting votes, recalculating strategies, and pleading with reluctant lawmakers. But every time progress seemed near, new demands emerged. Some wanted steep cuts in healthcare funding, others demanded rollbacks on environmental regulations, while a small but vocal faction pushed to eliminate all foreign aid from the bill. The White House, watching from afar, applied its own pressure. Advisors called Republican moderates, warning of political disaster if the government shut down. At the same time, activists staged sit-ins outside congressional offices, chanting slogans that carried through the marble hallways. Federal workers, fearing the worst, began organizing rallies, holding up pay stubs as symbols of what was at risk. Inside the chamber, tempers flared to dangerous levels. One heated debate nearly devolved into physical confrontation as lawmakers shouted over one another, red-faced and exhausted. The speaker tried to calm the room, reminding them of the catastrophic fallout if they failed, but his words carried less weight than before. Trust was eroding rapidly, not just between parties but within the very coalition that was supposed to lead. By evening, the sense of impending collapse was unavoidable. Markets were unstable, families were panicked, and lawmakers were tearing each other apart. The November plan, once pitched as a solution, now hung by a thread. The pressure was immense, the choices few, and the consequences, if no agreement was reached, were certain to ripple far beyond Washington. The nation stood on edge, waiting to see whether leaders would rise to the challenge or let the government plunge into chaos. The day of the vote arrived like a storm rolling in. Capitol Hill buzzed with a nervous energy as lawmakers filed into the chamber, their faces set with determination, worry, or calculation depending on where they stood. Television cameras zoomed in on every handshake, every whisper, every subtle glance between rivals and reluctant allies. The speaker paced quietly near the front, his phone still in hand as aides whispered the latest vote counts. They were close, too close, and the margins were fragile. Any shift, any sudden defection, could spell disaster. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting from every direction. Lobbyists worked the hallways, pulling members aside with promises or threats tied to future campaign funding. The White House called wavering moderates, urging them to think of the national interest over political points. Activists lined the corridors, chanting slogans that echoed through the marble halls, some cheering for the bill, others condemning it as a sham. The weight of expectation bore down on every representative in the chamber. When the debate opened, the tension erupted into a fiery spectacle broadcast live across the nation. Republicans who supported the plan framed it as a necessary step to keep the country running, insisting that short-term stability was better than immediate chaos. "This is not about politics," one congressman declared passionately. "This is about keeping America open, keeping our military funded, keeping families from going hungry." His words drew applause from allies but sneers from hardliners who saw the plan as a betrayal. The opposition fired back just as fiercely. Democrats accused the GOP of creating the crisis in the first place, painting the plan as a cynical maneuver to kick the problem into the next election cycle. "You don't get to light a fire and then parade around as heroes for pouring a cup of water on it," one Democratic leader thundered, her voice rising above the clamor. The crowd of protesters outside roared in response as her words spread across social media within seconds. The debate stretched for hours, filled with passionate speeches, strategic interruptions, and sudden bursts of applause. Each side grew more